The white scales caught every ray of the setting suns. 3 red orbs hung low over the dunes of Sarvith, painting the desert in shades of blood and rust. Under a shelf of black rock, the hatchling pressed herself into shadows that refused to hide her pale body. She had learned long ago that hiding was pointless when your scales reflected light like polished bone. Scales remembered her hatching. The shell had cracked open to reveal not the bronze or crimson hide expected of dragon young, but something wrong. Pure white, eyes like pink gems, a body that screamed defect to every dragon that looked upon her. The matriarch had circled the nest once, twice, her massive head lowering to inspect the pale thing that crawled from broken shell. Then she had turned away. No words, no acknowledgement. Just the terrible silence of rejection. Her siblings had emerged hours later, proper dragons with proper colors. They tumbled over each other, calling out in high chirps and growls. When scales approached, they scattered. By the 3rd day, they learned to ignore her completely. By the 10th, they had started their first flights. Awkward, clumsy launches into the hot desert air, but flights nonetheless. Scales watched from the ground, her own wings too weak, her body too small. The matriarch led them away on the 15th day. Scales had followed for a while, her legs carrying her across the sand until exhaustion dropped her in her tracks. She watched the flight disappear into the western sky. No one looked back. That had been 40 days ago, maybe 50. She had stopped counting when the loneliness became too heavy to measure in numbers. The desert provided enough food if you knew where to look. Sand rats burrowed in the cool places. Beetles gathered under rocks at dawn. She survived, but surviving was not the same as living. The triple sunset was her favorite time. The heat broke, the predators retreated to their dens, and for a few precious moments, the world felt less hostile. She emerged from her rocky shelter and climbed to the top of a nearby dune. From here, she could see for miles. Red sand, black rocks, the occasional twisted tree clinging to life near an underground spring. Empty. Always empty. Except today, something moved on the horizon. Scales froze, instinct screaming at her to run. But curiosity held her in place. The shape was wrong for a dragon. Too low to the ground, moving in a straight line rather than the swooping patterns of flight. It kicked up a trail of dust that hung in the still air like a scar across the landscape. She crept down the dune, following the ridgeline to stay out of sight. The thing grew larger. It was massive, a rolling box of metal and glass that somehow moved without legs. Black marks stretched behind it in the sand, parallel lines that spoke of wheels or treads. The sound reached her next, a deep rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground. Scales had never seen a machine before. Dragons built nothing, needed nothing beyond their own bodies. But stories existed, passed down through generations. Tales of the other races, the ones who shaped metal and rode the sky in artificial wings. Humans, they were called. Small creatures, weak and soft, who made up for their fragility with cleverness and tools. The machine slowed. Its growl became a sputter. It rolled another 100 feet and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a section of it opened with a hiss of escaping air. A figure climbed out, 2 legs, 2 arms, a body covered in fabric rather than scales or fur. The human was smaller than Scales expected, barely twice her own height. It moved around the machine, knelt beside one of the wheels, and made sounds that she somehow understood as frustration. The language was alien, but the tone was universal. Scales crept closer, using a cluster of rocks for cover. She watched the human open panels on the machine's side, pull out tools, and begin working on something she could not see. Its movements were precise, practiced. This was not its first time fixing whatever had broken. The wind picked up. Scales tasted the air and felt her stomach tighten. Storm. A big one, coming fast from the east. The human seemed to sense it too. It straightened, looked toward the darkening horizon, and the sounds it made became more urgent. It worked faster now, hands moving in a blur. Scales knew what desert storms could do. She had weathered 3 already in her short life. pressed against rocks while sand scoured everything in its path. The human's machine would offer protection, but only if the human could finish repairs in time. She watched it struggle with a piece of metal, trying to force it into place. The wind grew stronger. The first grains of sand began to skip across the dunes. The human abandoned its work and climbed back into the machine. The door sealed shut. For a moment, Scales thought it would try to drive away despite the broken part. But the machine sat silent. Through the transparent sections of its shell, she could see the human inside, checking devices and preparing for the storm. The eastern sky had turned black. Lightning flickered in the clouds, purple and violet. Scales knew she needed to find shelter, but her usual spots would not be enough. This storm would be worse than the others. She looked at the machine, at the human visible through its windows, and made a decision that terrified her. She emerged from behind the rocks and walked toward the machine. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to never expose herself to another creature that might reject her. But the alternative was facing the storm alone. Again, the human saw her. She watched its eyes go wide through the transparent barrier. It stared at her white scales and pink eyes, at the way she was clearly a dragon, but clearly wrong. She waited for it to turn away, like the matriarch had. Waited for rejection. Instead, a section of the machine opened. Not the door the human had used, but a larger opening in the back. The human appeared in the gap, still inside, but visible now. It made sounds and gestures, waving at her, pointing at the space inside. In invitation, the wind howled. Sand stung her scales. Behind her, the storm wall approached like a living thing, ready to devour everything in its path. Ahead, a human offered shelter to a creature it had never seen before. Scales ran forward and dove into the machine's belly just as the storm hit. The cargo bay smelled of metal and something organic that Scales could not identify. She pressed against the far wall, making herself as small as possible while the storm hammered the machine from outside. The noise was incredible, worse than anything she had experienced in the open desert. Sand struck the metal shell like a million tiny claws, creating a constant roar that made her ears flatten against her skull. The human had closed the bay door the moment she was inside. Now it sat on a stack of containers, watching her with an expression she could not read. Not fear exactly, not aggression either. Something in between, careful and evaluating. They studied each other in the dim light that filtered through sealed gaps in the cargo area. Ben Carter had spent 6 years hauling freight across frontier worlds. He had seen plenty of strange things in that time. Three-eyed merchants, crystalline life, forms that communicated through light pulses, sentient plants that negotiated shipping contracts through chemical signals. But he had never been in an enclosed space with a dragon before, let alone one that looked like it had been dipped in bleach. The hatchling was smaller than he expected. Maybe the size of a large dog, though the tail added another 4 feet of length. Those wings, folded tight against her sides, looked too delicate for flight. The white scales were not quite uniform. In the flickering light, he could see hints of pale blue and silver like oil on water. And those eyes, pink, watching his every movement with an intelligence that made his spine tingle, he decided to try talking. It was stupid, probably pointless, but the silence felt worse than looking foolish. Besides, there was no one around to judge him. "So," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Rough day." The hatchling's head tilted slightly. The pink eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate. Ben reached for his supply pack and pulled out a canteen. The water inside was lukewarm and tasted like recycle system output, but it was wet. He took a sip, then held it out toward the dragon. "Thirsty?" No response. The hatchling remained pressed against the wall, but her eyes tracked the canteen. Ben sat on the floor between them and pushed it forward with his boot. It rolled a few inches and stopped. Minutes passed. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Ben pulled out a ration bar, tore open the wrapper, and took a bite. Cardboard pretending to be food, flavored with artificial chicken and promises of adequate nutrition. He had eaten worse. The hatchling's nostrils flared. Her tongue, thin and forked, flicked out to taste the air. Ben watched her watching the food. He broke off half the bar and tossed it gently in her direction. It landed a few feet from her front claws. She did not move immediately. Her gaze shifted from the food to Ben to the food again, calculating, weighing risk against hunger. Finally, slowly, she stretched her neck forward and sniffed the offered portion. One quick motion, and it disappeared into her jaws. She chewed twice and swallowed. Ben smiled. Tastes like garbage, right? Yeah, they all do, but keeps you moving. He finished his half and pulled out another bar. This time he tossed it without waiting. The hatchling caught it midair with a snap of her jaws that revealed rows of small, sharp teeth. She settled into a more relaxed position, no longer pressed against the wall like she expected an attack. The canteen came next. Ben demonstrated by taking another sip, then rolled it closer to her. The hatchling approached cautiously, sniffed the opening, and lapped at the water with that thin tongue. Her eyes closed briefly, a gesture that seemed almost like gratitude. They sat like that for an hour while the storm raged outside. Ben talked to fill the silence, telling her about his route, the cargo he carried, the colonies he supplied. Medical equipment bound for a mining outpost on the northern continent. Simple stuff, but those miners needed it, and he needed the credits. He told her about the broken hydraulic line, about how he had been running the system too hard for too long and finally paid the price. The hatchling listened. Ben could not explain how he knew she was actually listening rather than just tolerating his voice, but something in her posture suggested attention. Her head turned to follow his gestures. Her eyes focused when he pointed at things. Once, when he mentioned dragons, her whole body tensed. You are one, right? He asked, knowing she could not answer. Dragon, I mean, though you're not like the ones I have seen in vids. They're usually brown or red or black. You are. He searched for a word that would not sound insulting. Unique. The hatchling's wings twitched. Ben took that as acknowledgement. As the storm continued, Ben pulled out his datapad and began scrolling through files. Inventory lists, navigation charts, messages from clients. The hatchling's attention shifted to the glowing screen. She moved closer, just a few inches, her neck craning to see what held his focus. Ben noticed and turned the pad toward her. This, just a map, shows where we are going. He pulled up an image file, a photo from his last stop. A settlement built into a canyon wall, lights glowing in the twilight. This is Port Hayes. Took this picture 2 weeks ago. The hatchling stared at the image. Her claw reached out, hesitant, and touched the screen. The photo changed to the next one in the sequence. She jerked back, startled. Ben left. It is okay. Look, you can, he demonstrated, swiping through photos. A space station, a cargo ship in flight, a marketplace crowded with a dozen different species. The hatchling watched each image with what could only be described as wonder. Outside, the storm began to weaken. The constant roar faded to a steady hiss of wind and sand. Ben checked his chronometer. 4 hours had passed. The hatchling had moved from the far wall to sitting just a few feet away, still cautious but no longer terrified. He showed her more images, explained what each one represented. She did not understand his words. He was sure of that. But she understood that he was sharing something with her, including her in a way that felt deliberate and kind. When the storm finally ended and silence fell over the desert, Ben realized he had a problem. He needed to leave to complete his delivery and get paid. But the hatchling had no reason to go with him and every reason to return to whatever life she had carved out in this wasteland. That he looked at her, at those strange pink eyes that held too much intelligence to ignore, and felt something shift in his chest. A decision forming, still rough and unexamined, but growing stronger with each passing second. You want to see more? He asked quietly. More than just pictures? The hatchling tilted her head, watching, waiting, listening to words she did not know, but somehow, impossibly, seemed to understand. Dawn arrived with 3 suns rising over dunes reshaped by the storm. The cargo hauler sat half-buried, sand piled against its western side like a wave frozen mid-crash. Ben stood outside, squinting at the damage and running calculations in his head. 4 hours of digging, maybe 5 if the sand was packed tight, then another 2 hours on the hydraulic line, if nothing else had broken during the night. The bay door was open behind him. Scales emerged slowly, testing the morning air with cautious sniffs. Her white body caught the early light and practically glowed against the red landscape. She watched Ben circle the hauler, saw the way his shoulders tensed when he reached the buried wheels. Ben grabbed a collapsible shovel from his equipment locker and started digging. The sand was heavy, made heavier by moisture it had absorbed from the storm's brief rain. He worked in rhythmic motions, scooping and tossing, while sweat began to darken his shirt. Scales approached the opposite wheel. She studied the problem, the way the sand pressed against the metal, creating a barrier that needed to be removed. Her claws, designed for gripping prey and climbing rocks, were not shaped for shoveling, but they were sharp and strong. She began scraping at the sand, pulling it away in chunks rather than scoops. Ben noticed and stopped mid-motion. He stared at the dragon working beside him, mimicking his intent, if not his method. A laugh burst out of him, unexpected and genuine. Well then, guess we're doing this together. They worked side by side for the next hour. Ben dug with his shovel, while Scales used her claws and occasionally her snout to push larger amounts of sand away from the hauler. The work was hard and hot, and both of them had to stop frequently for water. Ben shared his canteen freely, no longer worried about the dragon's intentions. By mid-morning, the wheels were clear. Ben moved on to the hydraulic line, crawling under the hauler with his toolkit. The line had split along a weak point, probably stressed by months of rough terrain. He needed to cut out the damaged section and splice in a replacement segment from his spare parts. The work required him to reach into tight spaces between the undercarriage supports. His hands were too large, his arms not quite long enough to get the right angle. He grunted with frustration, withdrew, and tried again from a different position. Same result. Scales watched from a few feet away. She saw the problem clearly. The human needed to reach something his body could not access. She moved closer, lowered her head, and chirped softly to get his attention. Ben slid out from under the hauler and looked at her. She was staring at the space he had been trying to reach, then at her own smaller frame. Understanding hit him like a physical thing. "You think you can fit in there?" he asked. She tilted her head. He took that as a maybe. Ben grabbed his smallest wrench and held it out to her. Scales sniffed it, then carefully took it in her jaws. She did not bite down hard enough to damage it, just held it securely. Ben felt a grin spread across his face. "Okay, let me show you what needs to happen." He crawled back under the hauler and pointed at the bolt that needed turning. Scales followed, her smaller body navigating the cramped space easily. She moved to where he pointed, the wrench still held in her jaws. Ben guided her head into position, helping her fit the wrench onto the bolt. Then he made a turning motion with his hand. Scales understood. She twisted her neck, applying pressure. The bolt resisted for a moment, then began to move. 3 full rotations, and it came free. She backed out carefully and dropped the wrench in Ben's waiting hand. They worked like that for the next 2 hours. Ben would position the tool and explain what needed to happen, using gestures and demonstrations. Scales would maneuver into spaces too small for human hands and execute the task. She learned quickly, adapting her grip and force based on what each situation required. When the hydraulic line was finally replaced and sealed, Ben tested the system and felt relief wash over him when pressure built normally. He crawled out from under the hauler and sat in the sand, exhausted but satisfied. Scales settled beside him, her white scales now streaked with hydraulic fluid and dust. They looked at each other, and Ben laughed again. "We make a decent team," he said. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention, and touched her shoulder. The scales were warm from the suns, smooth and hard like polished stone. Scales did not pull away. She leaned slightly into the contact, accepting it. Ben retrieved his datapad and pulled up the star chart. He had been thinking about this moment since the storm ended, running through options and consequences. The smart choice was to leave the dragon here. She belonged on this planet, with her own kind, living whatever life dragons were meant to live. Taking her would complicate everything. Haulers worked alone. Cargo ships did not carry passengers, especially exotic ones. The regulations alone would be a nightmare. But as he looked at her, at the intelligence in those pink eyes and the way she had worked beside him without hesitation, the smart choice felt wrong. Dragons did not help strangers repair machines. They did not learn to use tools in a single morning. They did not sit peacefully with humans and lean into gentle touches. This dragon was different. And maybe being different meant she did not belong here any more than he belonged back on Earth with family that had never understood why he needed to see the stars. He showed her the star chart, tracing the route to the spaceport with his finger. Hundreds of miles across desert and scrubland. 3 days if the hauler ran smoothly. Scales watched the moving marker, her eyes following the path. Ben pointed at the hauler, then at her, then at the distant point on the map that represented the spaceport. A question asked in gestures and hope. Scales looked at the map. She looked at the empty desert stretching in all directions. She looked at Ben, at the human who had shared his shelter and food and taught her that working together could solve problems neither could solve alone. She stood and walked to the hauler's passenger compartment. The door was open, the seat visible inside. She looked back at Ben once, then climbed up and settled into the seat like she had been doing it her whole life. Ben felt something tight in his chest loosen. He secured the cargo bay, checked all the repairs one final time, and climbed into the driver's seat. The hauler's engine rumbled to life, stronger now than it had sounded in weeks. Through the windscreen, the northern horizon beckoned. He glanced at Scales. She was watching the controls with intense focus, memorizing every detail. Learning. All right then, Ben said, putting the hauler in gear. Let's see where this takes us. The hauler rolled forward, leaving deep tracks in the sand. Behind them, the desert waited empty and uncaring. Ahead, the spaceport and all its complications loomed like a challenge they would face together. The hauler crossed terrain that shifted from red dunes to rocky plains to patches of scrubland where twisted vegetation clung to existence. Ben kept one eye on a navigation display and the other on the fuel gauge. 3 days to the spaceport meant 3 days of decisions he kept postponing. Scale sat in the passenger seat like she had always belonged there. She watched the landscape roll past with an attention that bordered on hunger. Every new type of rock formation, every color change in the soil, every creature that scattered from their path drew her focus. Ben found himself explaining things without thinking about it. Those are sandhawks, he said, pointing at dark shapes circling overhead. They ride the thermal currents, can stay up there for hours without flapping once. Scales followed his gesture, studying the birds with her head tilted. She made a soft sound, almost like a question. Ben glanced at her. You wonder what it is like to fly, do not you? He had noticed her wings, the way they stayed folded tight against her body. Too small for her frame, or maybe just underdeveloped. Maybe you will grow into them. Maybe you're just a late bloomer. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He had seen enough biology vids to know that albinism came with complications. Weaker bones, poorer vision, systems that did not develop right. This dragon had probably been abandoned for reasons beyond just her coloring. They drove through the afternoon heat. Ben rationed their water carefully, knowing the next reliable source was still a day away. Scale seemed content with small sips, more interested in watching the world transform around them than worrying about physical needs. As the suns began their descent, Ben spotted movement on the southern horizon. He slowed the hauler and reached for his scanner. The display showed multiple large heat signatures moving in formation. Dragons. A hunting party, maybe 6 or 7 adults, their flight path taking them roughly parallel to the hauler's route. Ben watched them through the windscreen. Massive creatures, their scales catching the fading light in shades of bronze and deep red. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. He felt the hauler suddenly feel very small and vulnerable. Scales had gone completely still. Her eyes tracked the distant dragons with an intensity that bordered on painful. Ben saw her body language shift, saw the way she pressed herself lower in the seat, as if trying to disappear. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. Recognition mixed with old wounds. The dragon flight seemed to notice the hauler. They adjusted course slightly, moving closer. Ben's hand moved to the accelerator, ready to push the hauler to its limits if needed. Dragons rarely bothered human vehicles, but rarely was not the same as never. The lead dragon dropped lower, close enough that Ben could make out individual scales. It flew alongside them for perhaps 30 seconds, its massive head turning to study the small machine and its occupants. Ben held his breath. Beside him, Scales had pressed herself against the seat back, making herself as invisible as possible. Then the dragon called out, a sound like rocks grinding together mixed with distant thunder. The hunting party responded and changed course, angling away toward the east. Within minutes, they were gone, nothing but specks against the darkening sky. Ben released a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked at Scales. She was still tense, still pressed against the seat, her pink eyes following the direction the dragons had disappeared. "They are gone," he said softly. "They did not care about us." Scales slowly relaxed. She turned to look at Ben, and something in her expression made his chest ache. Relief, certainly, but also something that looked like loneliness made worse by proximity. She had seen her own kind and felt nothing but the need to hide. Ben reached across and touched her shoulder again, the gesture becoming familiar between them. "I know what that is like," he said, "being around your own people and feeling more alone than when you are by yourself." He had left Earth 7 years ago. His family had thrown a goodbye party that felt more like a funeral. They could not understand why anyone would choose the uncertainty of frontier space over the security of home. His mother had cried. His father had called it running away. Maybe they had been right. But running toward something felt different than running away. Even if the result looked the same from the outside, they made camp that night beside a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind. Ben set up a portable light and shared rations with Scales. She ate slowly, her earlier excitement about the journey dampened by the encounter with the hunting party. Ben pulled out his datapad and cycled through photos again, but this time he did not narrate. He just let her look, let her see the variety of worlds and species that existed beyond this desert planet. Space stations that held millions. Cities built underwater. Colonies carved into asteroids. Each image a promise that the universe was bigger than any single species or any single planet. Scales watched until her eyes grew heavy. She curled up on a thermal blanket Ben had spread for her, her tail wrapped around her body. Ben sat nearby, ostensibly checking his inventory logs, but mostly just thinking. Taking her to the spaceport was one thing. Getting her off-planet was something else entirely. He had no legal right to transport her. Dragons were regulated, probably restricted. The authorities would have questions he could not answer. He should turn back now, leave her somewhere safe, continue alone like he had always done. But as he watched her sleep, her white scales reflecting the portable light in soft patterns, he knew he would not turn back. Whatever complications waited at the spaceport, they would face them together. He had made his choice when he opened the cargo bay during the storm. Everything after that was just momentum. The night grew cold. Ben wrapped himself in his own blanket and leaned against the hauler's wheel. Above them, stars filled the sky in numbers impossible to count. Scales shifted in her sleep, making small sounds that might have been dreams. Ben looked up at those stars and made a promise to himself. This dragon who had been rejected by her own kind would not be rejected by him. Not now. Not ever. Whatever it took, he would find a way to give her the life she deserved. One where being different was not a flaw, but a gift. One where she could look at her own reflection and see value instead of defect. The suns would rise in a few hours. They would drive through another day, getting closer to the spaceport and all its unknowns. But for now, in the quiet darkness of a desert night, a human and a dragon rested together. Two outcasts who had found in each other something neither had expected: acceptance. Partnership. The beginning of family. Ben closed his eyes and let sleep take him. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. The spaceport rose from the scrubland like a metal flower. Landing pads spread in concentric circles around a central tower, each pad occupied by vessels in various states of loading or repair. The afternoon shift was in full swing. Cargo loaders moved between ships, their mechanical arms carrying containers that humans could never lift alone. The air smelled of fuel and ozone and the particular staleness that came from recycled atmosphere. Ben guided the hauler through the outer checkpoint without issue. His credentials were valid, his cargo manifest clean. The security scanner did not register Scales as anything unusual, probably dismissing her heat signature as equipment in the passenger compartment. They rolled into the commercial section and found a parking spot near the cargo processing center. Ben sat in the driver's seat, hands still on the controls, staring at the bustling activity beyond the windscreen. Scales pressed her nose against the window, her eyes wide as she took in species she had never imagined. A Torgathy merchant stomped past on 4 thick legs, its tusked head bobbing as it argued with a human partner. 3 Sylvari moved in synchronized steps, their translucent bodies catching light and bending it into rainbow patterns. A maintenance bot rolled by, its mechanical voice calling out warnings in 6 different languages. This was it. The moment where Ben had to decide how to handle what came next. He could try to sneak Scales through the port and onto his ship. He could attempt to register her as cargo. He could leave her in the hauler while he completed his delivery and hope no one looked too closely. Every option felt wrong. Scales turned from the window and looked at him. Those pink eyes held trust that Ben had not earned, but somehow received anyway. She was waiting for him to lead, to show her what came next. The responsibility of that trust sat heavy on his shoulders. Ben made his decision. "We do this the honest way," he said aloud. "We walk in there together and deal with whatever happens." He opened his door. Scales hesitated only a moment before opening hers. The simple latch mechanism already familiar to her from watching Ben use it during their journey. They met at the front of the hauler. Ben squared his shoulders and started walking toward the cargo office. Scales followed at his side, her gait matching his stride. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Workers paused in their tasks. Every eye in the commercial section turned to watch the human and the white dragon cross the tarmac together. Ben kept his pace steady, his expression neutral. Scales kept close, her body language radiating nervousness, but her steps never faltering. They made it perhaps 50 feet before a Port Authority officer intercepted them. She was human, middle-aged, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of frontier work. Her uniform was crisp despite the heat, and her hand rested on the stun baton at her hip. "Stop right there," she said, her voice carrying authority without needing to shout. "Cargo hauler Ben Carter, registration number HC 7743." Ben stopped. "That is me." The officer circled them slowly, her eyes cataloging every detail of Scales. "And this is—" "Her name is Scales," Ben said, deciding that pretending ignorance would insult everyone involved. "I found her in the desert 3 days ago. She needed help. I gave it to her." "Dragons are restricted species," the officer said. "Regulation 47C requires quarantine and biological assessment before any dragon can be transported off-world. Did you not think to check regulations before bringing her in my port?" "I did not think about regulations at all," Ben admitted. "I thought about keeping her alive during a desert storm. Everything after that just kind of happened." The officer stopped circling and faced Ben directly. Her name tag read Officer Davis. "You understand this creates a significant problem. I should impound your vehicle and place the dragon in holding while we sort this out. That could take weeks." Scales pressed closer to Ben. He felt her trembling slightly and realized she understood more of the situation than he had given her credit for. She knew they were in trouble. She knew it had to do with her. "She is not like other dragons," Ben said, searching for words that would matter. "She understands. She learns. She helped me repair my hauler. She uses tools." Davis raised an eyebrow. "Dragons do not use tools." "This one does," Ben said firmly. "Give me a wrench, and I will prove it." Before Davis could respond, a voice called out from the growing crowd. "I will buy her." A Torgathy merchant pushed forward, his small eyes gleaming with commercial interest. 10,000 credits. Good price for exotic animal. Scales made a sound that was pure fear. She moved behind Ben, tried to use his body as a shield. Ben felt anger surge hot and immediate through his chest. She is not for sale, he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. The Torgathy waved a dismissive hand. 15,000. You cannot get better offer for defective dragon. Davis held up a hand, stopping Ben before he could do something that would definitely get him arrested. Nobody is buying anything. This situation requires proper assessment. She tapped her communicator. Davis to station. Get Dr. Raymond Liu down to cargo processing. Tell him it is urgent and unusual. They waited in tense silence. The crowd had grown, dozens of workers and travelers forming a loose circle around them. Scales stayed pressed against Ben, her breathing quick and shallow. Ben kept one hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort them both. Dr. Liu arrived 10 minutes later. He was older than Ben expected, with white hair and eyes that seemed magnified behind thick glasses. His assistant, a young woman carrying multiple scanner devices, followed close behind. Liu pushed through the crowd and stopped dead when he saw Scales. His mouth fell open. He took 2 steps closer, then 3, until Davis put a hand on his chest to stop him. Raymond, Davis said, this is the unusual situation. Human claims the dragon is intelligent beyond normal parameters. Can you assess? Liu did not answer immediately. He was staring at Scales with an expression that combined scientific fascination with something like wonder. Albino mutation, he whispered. Extremely rare. The literature suggests cognitive variations may accompany the physical mutation, but has never been documented because albino hatchlings typically do not survive to maturity. He looked at Ben. You said she uses tools? Ben nodded. Liu turned to his assistant. Give me the standard cognition test kit. The one we use for verifying sapience in ambiguous species. The assistant produced a small case. Liu opened it and pulled out a series of objects. A puzzle box with a sliding mechanism. A set of colored blocks that fit together in specific patterns. A simple tool that required multiple steps to operate correctly. That he set them on the ground between himself and Scales. Then he stepped back and waited. Scales looked at Ben. He nodded encouragement. She approached the objects cautiously, sniffed them, then picked up the puzzle box in her claws. She turned it over twice, studying the mechanism. Then, deliberately and carefully, she slid the panels in the correct sequence. The box opened. The crowd murmured. Liu made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Again, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Try the blocks. Scales completed each test. Not quickly, but methodically, working through the problems with visible thought processes. When she finished, she looked up at Liu and made a sound that seemed almost questioning. Did I do it right? Liu turned to Davis. His face had gone pale. This is unprecedented, he said quietly. Dragons are intelligent, certainly, but they do not problem solve like this. They do not seek approval. They do not show curiosity about abstract challenges. He looked back at Scales. She is not just intelligent. She is sapient. Davis absorbed this information. Her hand had moved away from her stun baton. Meaning what exactly? Meaning, Liu said carefully, that she might not fall under the same regulations as normal dragons. Sapient beings have different legal status than animals. But we would need more tests, more observations. This is genuinely uncharted territory. The Torgathy merchant had gone quiet. Several other spectators were recording on their devices. Ben felt the weight of all those eyes and realized that whatever happened next, Scales had just changed how at least some people would think about dragons. Davis made a decision. Dr. Liu, you will oversee extended assessment. Mr. Carter, the dragon stays with you for now, but you are both restricted to the port until we sort this out. No departures. No unauthorized movement. Understood. Ben nodded, relief flooding through him despite the restrictions. Understood. Scales pressed against his leg. He looked down at her and saw something new in those pink eyes. Not just trust or fear or confusion. Understanding. She knew what had just happened. She knew they had won something important, even if the larger battle was not yet over. Together, they had bought time. And time was all Ben needed to figure out the next move. The Port Authority conference room smelled of recycled air and cold coffee. Ben sat in a chair designed for beings much larger than humans, his feet barely touching the floor. Scales lay beside him, her head resting on her front claws, her eyes tracking every person who entered the room. 3 hours had passed since the incident on the tarmac. 3 hours of waiting while Davis, Lou, and various other officials conferred in adjacent offices. Through the transparent wall, Ben could see them gesturing, reviewing data on screens, arguing points he could not hear. Lou had spent the first hour running tests, memory exercises, pattern recognition, social cue interpretation. Scales had cooperated with everything, her natural curiosity overriding her nervousness. She had even allowed Lou to take scale samples and blood for genetic analysis, though Ben had held her steady during the needle insertion. The results sat on the table now, displayed on multiple data pads. Ben had seen enough of them to understand the implications. Scales was not just intelligent for a dragon. She was intelligent in ways that matched or exceeded many recognized sapient species. Her genetic mutation had apparently rewired more than just her pigmentation. Her brain structure showed variations that Lou called remarkable and unprecedented in equal measure. The door opened. Davis entered first, followed by Lou and two other officials Ben had not met. They arranged themselves on the opposite side of the table. Davis folded her hands and looked directly at Ben. "This is complicated," she began without preamble. Dr. Lou's assessment suggests sapience. His genetic analysis supports anomalous cognitive development. But there are no precedents for individual dragons being granted sapient status. The species as a whole is classified as intelligent fauna, not persons. "Then change the classification," Ben said. "You have the evidence." "It is not that simple," one of the other officials said. She was Silvari, her translucent body shifting colors with her mood, currently showing yellow, which Ben interpreted as caution. Species classifications require approval from the Galactic Coordination Council. That process takes years. "So what happens now?" Ben asked, feeling his frustration build. "You keep her in bureaucratic limbo while committees argue about definitions." Davis held up a hand. "Let me finish. We cannot change her species classification immediately, but we can establish individual status based on demonstrated capabilities. Dr. Lou has agreed to sponsor an emergency petition for provisional sapient recognition. If approved, it would grant her legal personhood on a case-by-case basis." Ben felt hope stir in his chest. How long does that take? For an emergency petition with supporting evidence this strong? Davis consulted her datapad. 48 hours, assuming no major objections are filed. And in the meantime, Davis said, her expression softening slightly, "She stays with you. But there are conditions. You must register as her legal guardian. You are responsible for her actions, her welfare, and her integration into civilized space. You must agree to regular check-ins with Dr. Lou for ongoing assessment. And you must complete a course on sapient rights and responsibilities." Ben looked at Scales. She was watching him, waiting for his response. He thought about what he was signing up for. Not just responsibility for another being, but advocacy against systems that would see her as property or threat. It would complicate his life in ways he could barely imagine that he thought about his hauler, designed for one. His contracts, structured for solo work. His existence at the edges of civilized space, deliberately chosen to avoid complications exactly like this. Then he thought about a white dragon huddled under rocks in a desert, rejected by her own kind, waiting to die alone. "Where do I sign?" he said. The paperwork took another hour. Ben signed his name more times than seemed reasonable, agreeing to terms and conditions and oversight protocols. Scales watched the process with visible confusion, her head tilting at the strange human ritual of marking documents to make things official. When it was finished, Davis slid a final document across the table. "This is temporary guardianship, valid until the emergency petition is resolved. After that, if she is granted sapient status, she becomes her own person and can choose whether to maintain association with you." Ben read the document carefully. Then he looked at Scales. "You understand what is happening? They're saying you might be recognized as a person. Your own person, not property, not pet. A person with rights and choices." Scales stared at him. Her mouth opened, and for a moment Ben expected another of those soft chirps she made when confused or curious. Instead, something different emerged, a sound that shaped itself around intent, forcing foreign anatomy to produce human phonetics. Ben. The room went silent. Ben felt his breath catch. It was rough, barely more than a growl shaped into syllables, but it was his name. She had spoken his name. Lou leaned forward, his eyes wide behind his glasses. She is verbalizing. I did not think her vocal structure could manage human speech sounds. Ben, Scales said again, more clearly this time. She moved closer to him, pressed her head against his arm. Then, struggling with the unfamiliar shapes, she added two more words. Stay together. Ben felt something break open in his chest. He put his arm around her neck, this impossible creature who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. We stay together. Davis cleared her throat, clearly affected despite her professional demeanor. Well then, that simplifies things considerably. A sapient being expressing clear preferences about guardianship. Dr. Liu, document that for the petition. They left the conference room an hour later. The suns had set while they were inside, replaced by the artificial lights of the spaceport. Ben's cargo delivery could wait until morning. Right now, he needed food, sleep, and time to process everything that had happened. They walked through the port together, drawing stares but fewer than before. Word had spread, as word always did in small frontier communities. The white dragon who could think. The human who had refused to abandon her. Their story was already taking on a life of its own. Ben found a small hotel that catered to off-world travelers. The clerk barely blinked at Scales, just charged extra for a larger room, and made a note in the system. They climbed 3 flights of stairs to a corner room with 2 beds and a window overlooking the landing pads. Scales went immediately to the window, pressing her nose against the glass. Outside, ships came and went, their engines glowing blue and white against the darkness. Each departure left trails of light that faded slowly into the night sky. Ben stood beside her. Tomorrow, we complete the delivery. Day after that, if the petition goes through, we figure out where to go next. There are colonies out past the reach that could use supply runs. Places where being different is not a problem, because everyone there is different. Scales turned from the window and looked at him. Her pink eyes caught the light from the landing pads, reflecting it in patterns that were beautiful and strange. She opened her mouth and spoke again, the words coming easier now that she had broken through some barrier in her mind. Home, she said. Then, touching his hand with her claw, Ben is home. He had spent 7 years traveling between worlds, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had told himself that freedom meant movement, that home was wherever his hauler was parked. But standing in a cheap hotel room on a frontier world with a dragon who had learned to speak just to tell him he mattered, Ben understood what he had been running from. Not the lack of home. The fear of finding one and losing it. Yeah, he said quietly. Home is wherever we are together. They settled in for the night. Scales curled up on the bed closer to the window, her eyes watching the ships until sleep claimed her. Ben lay in the other bed, his mind too active for rest, 48 hours until they knew if the petition would be approved. 48 hours until Scales would be legally recognized as a person or remain classified as intelligent fauna. But regardless of what the bureaucrats decided, Ben knew the truth. He had left Earth alone, running from expectations he could not meet. He had spent years in self-imposed isolation, convincing himself that solitude was strength. Then a storm had brought him a dragon that should not exist, and she had shown him that strength was not about standing alone. The IT was about standing together. Outside, another ship lifted off, its engines painting light across the darkness. Inside, a human and a dragon slept peacefully, their future uncertain but their bond unbreakable. The galaxy was vast and often unforgiving, but in the spaces between stars, 2 outcasts had proven that family was not about biology or species, that IT was about choice. About seeing value where others saw defect. About refusing to abandon those who needed you, Even when every practical reason said you should not, it was about a human who stopped for a dragon in the dunes. And a dragon who learned to speak to tell him he was home. Tomorrow would bring his challenges. They would face them together. And that made all the difference.